So it has been 2 years now since me and my wife and my daughter moved to Hong Kong. A bit of a background, I am from Hong Kong, but my wife was born in Alabama and grew up in Tennessee. And we met in Tennessee and later moved to DC, and we lived there for like 7 years. But anyway, in all, I have lived in the US for about 20 years in essentially all my adult life. So why did I leave the US for Hong Kong? Well, of course, because of personal reasons. Because of course it's because of personal reasons, which includes personal circumstances like family, but also personal beliefs, like what I value in a place, and also what I can afford and what I want in my life. So of course it's personal. Well, to start, it's already kind of a privilege to be able to choose which city to live in at all. Most people just stay in the same place where they grew up. And for those who move around, most of them do it for reasons that are out of their control, like a job or an education opportunity that they cannot afford to turn down, or maybe they're even maybe they're refugees. So it's truly a privilege to be able to live in a city that satisfies both my circumstances but also my values. So we're pretty lucky. But full disclosure here, by lucky I don't mean that we're rich. By most standards. I'm also not saying that, we're not rich, like how rich people like to say they're not rich, they're comfortable. So for full transparency, our entire household income is just about 100,000 US a year. If you've ever lived in a major city in a developed country, you will know that's not too comfortable. But somehow we managed to be quite comfortable, I think, in Hong Kong, mostly because we don't have to pay rent because we live with my mom. But that's not all of it. So I'll get into more details as we go on. By the way, most of what you'll see in this video is just going to be clips I took in Washington, D.C. and also in Kwun Tong, which is apparently the poorest district in Hong Kong, even though it doesn't feel like it. I grew up here, and now we're raising our kids here. And the local government has done quite a lot to spruce up the parks here over the last 10-20 years. Okay, let's talk about my circumstances. Here's what happened leading up to our move in 2023. So our first child was born in 2021. And we wanted her to learn Chinese eventually, and to do that effectively, we need to move back to Hong Kong or some other place in China, because it's just very, very difficult for a child to sustain fluency in a second language without immersion in general, unless that second language is English, because of the legacy of the British Empire and the global dominance of American media, etc. So we wanted to move back before she would start primary school. But then, before she turned 1, my dad passed away, so my mom was living and grieving by herself. Then, in 2022, both me and my wife lost our jobs in the same month. And it was purely coincidental, too. We worked in completely different industries. So it was kind of like a sign for us to move back earlier than planned. And over the next few months, we sold our condo in DC, and we got rid of most of our stuff, which we didn't own too many things to begin with because we lived in a one-bedroom condo, like less than 500 square feet. And then we just moved to Hong Kong with 1 checked luggage and 1 carry-on, plus about 4 like medium-sized boxes of stuff that we sent. Since we moved to Hong Kong, we have been living with my mom, who is still living in the same 2-bedroom, 500 square feet flat that I grew up in. And because the apartment was completely paid for since 1985, we don't have to pay rent. Although I do have to cover part of my mom's living expenses and give her a monthly stipend, so to speak. But that costs only about half of what we would pay for rent if we lived by ourselves. So for context, the rent for where we're living right now, if we pay for it, would be around $2,500 US a month. I'm using US dollars in this video. So rent in Hong Kong isn't as crazy as you may think if you know where to look. So it's not all like subdivided flats and cage homes. I'll make another video about the different types of living conditions in Hong Kong because it's more diverse than what most people may think. So we enjoyed our honeymoon period with the new city, at least for my wife, who's from a very, very small town. And even though we lived in DC, Hong Kong still feel really big. So anyway, and we didn't feel too anxious about both being unemployed as well, because I did have a few leads, one of which I was pretty confident about, which I ended up getting. And it was a work from home position, so it was perfect because I get to spend more time with my family. And also because we no longer have the financial pressure to have to pay for mortgage and health insurance and cars and other expenses that we would have if we stayed in the US. My wife can also choose to be a stay-at-home mom and spend more time with the kids. And the reason I said kids, plural, is because our second child, this time a boy, was born about a year after we moved to Hong Kong. Here's the thing about Hong Kong. Once housing is taken care of, everything else is quite affordable relative to the US. So depending if you qualify for public housing and if you rent or own, or if you own, depending on if that's paid off, your financial situation could be very, very different. And I think that's kind of the same in most places in the developed world. So the housing problem is the everything problem. There's a saying that there's two Americas, depending on if you rent or own. But actually, I think there are way more than two Americas, because it also depends on a bunch of other things, right? So my point is, all the videos that you see that ranks which city has the best quality of life, they're kind of garbage, useless. Because it depends on who you are, what industry you're in, how much savings you have, what stage in your life and career you're at. If you want to have a career or a family, what kind of family and what kind of career, etc. Right? For instance, I've always thought it was better to be poor in a small town than poor in a city. So Knoxville was better for me than Hong Kong at one point when I was a graduate student, and because I couldn't have afforded Hong Kong, and I wasn't at a stage of my life where I would appreciate living with my mom, which I unironically do now. And by the way, most of those most livable cities in the world list that you see on the internet, they're almost always designed for well-to-do expats. So most of the time it's just applicable it's from the perspective of kind of finance bros in their 20s and 30s. I'm generalizing a bit, but my point is those rankings are meaningful only to a very small sliver of the general population. That aside, I'll try to build the best objective case for why I think Hong Kong is a good place to live for me, and perhaps also for you. So, and I'm not going to talk about politics, by the way, although that's perhaps the elephant in the room that people want to hear about. I just don't prefer talking about ideologies in a one-way monologue format. If you see me at a bar, we can have a conversation about it, sure. But in this video, I'm going to focus on the kind of boots-on-the-ground experience when it comes to day-to-day living here versus day-to-day living in the US. So, first of all, if you like being in a city, Hong Kong is great for that. If you like all the positive things about the city, Hong Kong is good. It's extremely safe in terms of crime and also in terms of infrastructure and things to do. And there are plenty of things to do and things you can walk to every day. It's very accessible. It means you can walk around by yourself at any time of the day and at night without the fear of being robbed, and also without the fear of getting run over or getting lost, because you're never that far away from a subway stop or a bus stop or a convenience store or a park or a shopping mall or a swimming pool or a farmer's market or a restaurant or a cafe. Everything is everywhere, and it's fun and it's safe to just explore. That is, unless you wander into the mountains, which gets to my second point. Hong Kong also has tons of nature weaved into the city, and they're not, like nicely planned and manicured parks. We have some of those too, but I'm talking about just raw nature, and it's because of the history and geography of Hong Kong. You have very easy access to the mountains and jungles regardless of where you live in the city. There are parts of the city I don't even know if it qualifies as the city, but it's part within Hong Kong where you can literally get lost for days and turn up dead if nobody know that you're lost. So yeah, there are just areas that look like you are days away from civilization, even though maybe it's just a bus ride and a couple hours of hikes away. Just look up videos on Hong Kong nature on YouTube, you'll find them. And it's precisely because of this hostile natural landscape, which takes up about 80% of the entire city by area, the density of the developed area is just insane, right? Because the mountains and jungles, they simply don't allow urban sprawl to happen to any degree organically compared to other cities. Which is why I think even animators from Japan like to use Hong Kong as the backdrop of like cyberpunk anime instead of Tokyo, because the actual urban parts of Hong Kong is just crazy dense, and this density doesn't really peter out anywhere. So what we have are these high density urban veins kind of that creeps along the coastline and the valleys right up against the ocean and the mountains. Which gets to my third point. So while there are rich and poor districts in Hong Kong to a certain degree, it's not as centralized geographically like most other cities, right? With a dense and expensive urban core surrounded by less dense and cheaper suburbs, where the demographics kind of split into like good and bad and cheap and the expensive neighborhoods, where you can deal with balancing, cost of living against school quality and crime and access to grocery stores, etc. In Hong Kong, most neighborhoods have a good mix of people from all different income levels, sharing the same mall and the same subway station and neighborhood parks, to a certain degree, to a greater degree than American cities, from my experience, which I think makes it less stressful to decide where to live. And it also creates a more kind of continuous sense of community, if that makes sense. Right, compared to the US, where millennials especially are trying their best to balance revitalizing downtowns and the downsides of gentrification. But most of millennial parents still have to, they still choose to move back to the suburbs when they start a family because of this tension from the momentum carried over from historic segregation that's still around. And this ties loosely, I guess, to my fourth point. Besides physical infrastructure like trains and storm drains and hiking trails, Hong Kong also have very accessible non-physical infrastructure, so things like education and healthcare. Sure, Hong Kong people like to complain about how bad the healthcare and education is, and sure, if you want to send your kids to a Swiss international school, then the bang for your buck is pretty bad compared to, I don't know, boarding school in London or whatever. Oh no, the English teacher at my school is actually from India, and I wanted my kid to have a more high-class accent. Fuck you. So yeah, if you're not one of those people, and we're talking about free government public school and free government healthcare, I think they're pretty good because at least they're there, right? That's how. I mean, if you're European, you may have a different opinion, but I lived in America for 20 years, so my bar is pretty low here. And most people in Hong Kong uses these things most of the time. The bill for my wife to give birth to our daughter in DC when we're paying something like $300 a month for health insurance was about $1,000 US. Our bill for her to give birth to our son in Hong Kong, it was $40 US without insurance. So yes, the best things in life are free, like free healthcare and free education, and things like watching your kids grow up and have the time to savor it, because the government subsidized kindergarten is literally just downstairs. It's a 5-minute walk, so your kids don't have to commute to school. And there's also a playground. There's multiple playgrounds near where you live, where she can play with other kids. So that's another thing that's lacking in the US, I think, is the density of places where kids can kind of roam free and socialize with other kids. There are places like that, but they're mostly destinations that you have to make a trip to. In Hong Kong, they're so common that any trip we take, we just know that there will be a playground somewhere that she can play with other kids. Okay, so let's talk about money for a bit with some numbers. I know that people usually talk very vaguely about numbers, talk about money, so I'm gonna give some actual numbers. So first thing first, housing. Housing in Hong Kong is, you're probably expected to be outrageously expensive, right? The most expensive in the world? Yes, sort of, if you want to buy. Not necessarily if you're renting, at least not right now. The housing market fluctuates so much. Right now, if you're renting, it's pretty on par with most US cities, maybe even a little bit cheaper. For instance, the rent in the area that I'm living in for a 2-bedroom, 500 square feet, it would be about $2,500 US. But if you want to buy it, then your mortgage payment could be closer to $3,000 to $4,000 US, even with the 20% down payment. And that's because the real estate market here is irrational, which is a huge topic and will take too long to explain. So do some research online if you want to, but those are the numbers. But let's talk about some other costs like groceries. Expats may tell you that groceries in Hong Kong is not that different from the West. And that's true if you only shop at supermarkets. But where else can you shop for food? You can shop at wet markets, which is, I would say, at least 50% cheaper when it comes to produce. A pound of greens, like a pound of bok choy or something, or some kind of broccoli, that would cost me about $2. A big bag of sweet potatoes, about $2 at the wet market. At the supermarket, it will be something like $10, and even more if you go to fancy supermarkets like City Super, which is kind of like the Erewhon. I don't even know how to say that fancy supermarket in LA. Like, we have really high-end ones like that too, and it's called City Super. How about eating out? For a neighborhood chain where we would go because we're too lazy to cook, about $10 for a set. That will include a drink and an appetizer and the main entree. And there's no tipping culture here, so $10 is $10. There's no taxes either, and no sales tax. If you dine in, there would be a 10% surcharge built in, which is roughly half of what we would pay for a similar meal in DC. But there weren't too many cheap-ish options where we lived in DC because of gentrification and how downtowns are essentially entertainment districts for dates and tourists. So you can also go even cheaper in Hong Kong and get a bento box for like $5. Or if you want to go to Michelin star restaurants, those are here too. What about healthcare? I talked about earlier about how much it costs to give birth here. What about just going to the doctors for a regular checkup? So if you want to deal with the lines at public hospitals and clinics, it's pretty much free. It's by US standards anyway, maybe a few bucks. I think the prescriptions are almost always free. How about emergency room visits? So we took our son to the ER late one night because of a high fever, and it cost us $25. If you go to a private clinic, which usually have shorter lines, then it's about $50 per visit without insurance. And it depends on insurance. It may not cost you anything. Well, what about other things? Public swimming pools are great. Some of them have actually huge water slides. And they cost about maybe like $1.50. The subway here costs between $1 to $3 depending on how far you're traveling. Annie's all-day kindergarten, which goes from I think 9 to 5. It could be we can drop her off as early as 8 and pick her up as late as 6. That costs about $350 a month after government subsidy. Which comes with a morning snack, lunch, and an afternoon snack every day. Utilities are about $100 to $200 a month. HOA about $100 and $200 a month. We don't have a car, so I don't know how much that would cost. Gas is very, very expensive, however. Then when it comes to like vacations and travel, we can fly direct to Tokyo for I think $250 for a direct round trip. Or Beijing or Singapore or Bangkok in that same price range, pretty much for any major cities in East Asia. Direct flights to the US and to Europe are plenty as well, and they cost, depending on the season, anywhere between $1,200 to maybe $1,800. Okay, what about taxes? I actually did not have to pay any tax last year because we had a baby. And I think our rate this year will also be below 10%. We did have to file our taxes for the US as well, but we did not make enough money to have to pay like a foreign, like as an expat. There's a certain bracket that you have to go above to have to pay any federal tax in the US. So in Hong Kong, there is also no Social Security or Medicaid, Medicare that you have to pay on top of your taxes. Your tax is all you have to pay, and it maxes out in the teens, I think, like in terms of percentage, like 15 or 17%, I'm not sure. So the low taxes of Hong Kong is of course linked to all our land use problems, because the government make most of the revenue by leasing land to developers. That's a gross simplification of the Hong Kong economy. But again, from the ground level, when viewed in isolation, the low tax in Hong Kong makes a pretty big difference for us compared to what we paid in DC, in relate to the kind of services and infrastructure that we get back from the government. When we lived in the US, when both me and my wife were working, we were making maybe $150K a year, and our take home after tax was around $110K. So that's definitely more than what we make now with only me working. But remember, in the US, we also had to pay for daycare, which cost about $20K per year per kid. Now, kindergartens are free in DC, but that doesn't kick in until your kid turns 4. So if both parents are working, you need to pay for 4 years of daycare, which will cost you about $80K per kid before they turn 4, or $40K for 2 kids every year. So that's what we're saving by basically having my mom and my wife to stay home to take care of the baby, and having our older daughter in the government subsidized kindergarten when she turned 3. Our income now, it's just under 100K US with just me working. But even after tax, that number is still more than 90K. So even if we have to pay for housing in Hong Kong, because of the lower taxes and not having to pay for childcare, I think we would still come out on top financially compared to staying in the US. So is Hong Kong for everyone? Of course not. Nothing is for everyone. Some people like Paris, and some people might prefer, I don't know, Boise, Idaho. It depends on what you're into and what's important to you, and again, what you have and what you want. What I try to do here is to provide the main, what I consider to be at least objective reasons that explains to you, for you to understand why I chose to leave US for Hong Kong. But just saying, I think I left the US for Hong Kong, it's kind of misleading. Because I didn't leave the US for Hong Kong, right? I left DC for Hong Kong. That's more accurate. Right, and I left DC for Hong Kong because I was always leaving the city when I lived in DC anyway. I had to leave the city to go to the beach. I had to leave the city to go on a hike. I had to leave the city if I want to get Chinese groceries, or if I want Vietnamese food. I had to leave the city to do this and that. So I was always leaving anyway. But in Hong Kong, I have everything right here, so I never have to leave. Unless I want good Mexican food, then it's kind of a problem. My name is Yu Yun. Thank you for watching.